for any of the folks who are new to the content call, I'm Matt Schultz. I'm from Grand Valley State University. I'm one of the co-chairs of the content group. I'm also here with Lauren Work from Virginia. Lauren, do you want to say hi real quick?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jefferson, for coming on our call today.
Definitely. So for the folks who are new to the content interest group, what I'm going to do here, I don't know if Paige is with us, but Paige Walker from Boston College, she works with us on the group here. As new folks attend the calls, we put those folks in touch with Paige, and Paige gives them a little bit of information about the content interest group. I'm just going to real quick put her information in the chat. Her email is paigepb, P-A-I-G-E-P-B @bc.edu. So folks could certainly get in touch with Paige after the call here, and we can get you, if you're not on the listserv, we can get you set up on that. But what I thought we would do is just real quick for folks who've not ever attended these calls, just kind of frame what the content interest group is. So we're kind of in distinction to the infrastructure interest group and the standards group. We're looking a little bit more specifically at certain types and genres of digital content and what some of the preservation issues are with those. And the way that we've structured the calls is we typically sort of volley month to month between holding some administrative calls, and then queuing up some topics like this one today. So we're going to hear from Jefferson Bailey in just from Internet Archive in just a moment or two here. He's going to talk with us a little bit about web archiving. We've had a previous in April. We had a previous call on email preservation. So some folks from the EPAD, and you can. I've shared the minutes of the agenda, or the link to the agenda in the minutes that we document for the calls. If folks scroll down a little bit in that document, they'll hit the April 4th call, and they can tease through some of the content there. We were not able to record that EPAD call, but we are recording this call. So even the folks who maybe are having trouble connecting to Jefferson's slide, you'd be welcome to catch the recording after the call here today. So in any case, Lauren is, she's going to help us out here. She's going to be monitoring the chat. So if folks have questions throughout Jefferson's presentation, you can go ahead and queue up some questions. We're going to let Jefferson go through his presentation, and then we'll try and save about 15 minutes towards the end to cover some of those questions, but feel free to queue those up. Folks are probably going to see, I don't know if it shows up for them, but you've got the option of raising your hand throughout the presentation. What we'd like to reserve that for is if folks are maybe having some sort of a technical problem with the call, if they're not hearing something correctly, feel free to use that. Otherwise, if you've got some sort of a question for Jefferson, if possible, let's go ahead and save those towards the end. But feel free to use the raise the hand option if you need it. And then I think, other than that, that's about it. We'll ask folks to go ahead and mute their lines for us as we get Jefferson started here. Lauren, did you have any sort of real quick administrative things that you wanted to cover with folks before we dive in?
No, the only thing I'll highlight is that I dropped in our schedule for future content calls into the chat, which Matt had referenced. So if you're interested in what's up next after web archiving, have a look there. But other than that, that's about it. I'll let you all take it away.
Cool. Yeah, and Paige, thanks for clarifying your email address there. Sorry, I got that wrong. walkerpb@bc.edu, and that's in the chat as well. So thanks, Paige. Okay, so Jefferson, are you able to? I think you're able to sort of claim or grab the screen share.
Yep, over to you. I can do it now.
Take it away, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself. Yeah, so Jefferson and I had we played a lot of phone tag to get this call to happen, or a lot of email tag actually.
Yeah,
no, it's.
I believe you missed one call for a U2 concert. So
yeah. But yeah, no, it's good to hear your voice again, Jefferson. And we're looking forward to what you've got here. We've basically asked Jefferson to feel free to, give a bit of an overview and background on Internet Archive. We know lots of folks on the call are probably already somewhat familiar And then Jefferson, to the degree that you can, maybe just talk about, some of what you guys are seeing as, some of the primary risks and challenges to web content these days. And we're looking forward to the Q&A.
Yep.
So go ahead, dive in.
I might not go full screen because it seemed to not want to load. But can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks like it's got some content loading. There you go. Yep.
I guess let me know if you have any viewing problems. I'm not going to go full screen. I'll just leave it in the Google Slide window, browser window thing.
Yep, it looks like everything looks like you've got some motion and the.
Oh yeah, so yeah, the first slide has lots of graphics on it. So okay, I'll kick it off. I have a lot of slides, and I tend to talk pretty quickly and go through slides pretty quickly. So there should be plenty of time, but please do note questions, and we'll do them at the end. It might be a little hard to let stuff, but obviously, thank you to Matt and Lauren for inviting me. I'm always excited to talk.
And hey, Jefferson, this is Matt. One thing I will ask is maybe if you could just speak up a little bit more into your microphone.
Sure.
Perfect. That's great.
To speak more loudly. It's like a headset, so it's a little wonky. But I'll talk loud. So, okay. So thanks, Matt and Lauren, again, and thanks everyone who showed up for the call. So I am Jefferson, as Matt mentioned, and there's my title on the slide. I do web archiving and data services at the Internet Archive. And this fun slide is an actual real visualization that we have of screenshots of home pages as they're crawled for some of our global scale crawling. So, but we actually do have this visualization portal mostly for fun because it looks cool. So Matt sort of gave me some pointers on what to talk about in the call. So I tried to structure this to talk a lot about Internet Archive's role in web archiving, and so I don't want it to seem necessarily too IA-centric, but I think that we can provide some perspective on different parts of web archiving that others might not be able to, given the scale and history and all that stuff. So talk a little bit about IA. People mostly probably already know it, so I won't go into detail on that. We'll look at a quick timeline, just the fun slides of what we've done web archiving over the years, and then we'll talk about a couple of different approaches we use. And then, well, I said threads, that's a typo. So how about threats, risk, and challenges of what we see as current and forthcoming issues around collecting web-based content in the future, and then we'll do Q&A. So Internet Archive, we are a nonprofit digital library. We are a recognized state library in California, so we're a real library and archive. Nonprofit started in 1996 by Brewster Kahle, who was an early web technologist, built the first search engine, did a lot of big data, hardware, supercomputer stuff. So he came out of early technology around the internet and started Internet Archive to serve as a historical repository of the web. And our mission, of course, is universal access to all knowledge. So IA does lots of non-web stuff these days, but that is sort of how it's got its start, and that's the reason for the name. Our total collection of all content is around 40 petabytes unique currently. So obviously we have multiple copies of that. So sure, it's well over 100 total, but that's basically where we are in collecting, about 40 petabytes. So here's some quick numbers on all the things that we do that are mostly not web. We collect software, we collect moving image, we digitize books and have our own digitization centers, as well as doing them on contract, and we collect lots of audio, and now, of course, podcasts from the web and stuff like that. We collect 30 to 40 channels of television 24/7 as a direct stream, and of course, all sorts of now born digital publications, both on the web and not. The web archive is currently, I think on the recent index, just about 650 billion URLs. So we say URL because it's a direct link. That could be a web page, it could be a PDF, or it could be like a JavaScript file. So it usually breaks down to, if you think of it, websites is about half that number. So it's probably about 300 billion websites that make up 650 billion URLs. So we were the first institution to start collecting the web for historical preservation purposes in '96. So it was our 20-year anniversary a couple of years ago. And we sort of started won't go into the long tail history of how IA started, but there were crawling endeavors that Brewster was involved in. We took that data and started to preserve it, and that is how we started web archiving. And we also started doing that in partnerships with other places. So in '96, we worked closely with the Smithsonian and Library of Congress, and I'll just go through all these slides on the timeline pretty quickly. We, of course, started running our own crawls soon thereafter, like as Internet Archive, instead of like data that we get via donation or agreement from other places who are not interested in preserving it for crawling for services. We work very closely with the Library of Congress. We dedicated one of our crawls to them and continue to work closely with them. We do other government-focused collecting activities. We started with LC, but we've been every presidential election cycle, we do a end-of-term collaborative web harvesting activity with NARA and GPO and LC and a couple others to get snapshots of the U.S. federal government web domain before and after every administration change. So that goes on every 4 years. Launched the Wayback Machine, the access portal actually didn't come out until 2001, if people didn't know that. So we were crawling and archiving long before you could actually look at the stuff. But that is when it launched, and people are probably familiar with Wayback Machine, so I won't mention it. We get about 700,000 users a day, so it's pretty high traffic. Lots of press mentions and all kinds of stuff like that. We co-founded the Internet IIPC Internet Preservation Consortium in 2003 with 12 other national libraries across the world, and that's grown to a 55-ish member organization. That's the main international community consortial body for talking about preserving the web, and we're on the steering committee and pretty active in that.
Hey Jefferson.
Yep.
Can I pause you real quick here? And not just to you, but to others on the call here. All folks, please do make sure to mute both the mics on your computers, and if you're calling in, the mics on your phones. There's a little bit of fading in and out that we're getting reported on the line. I don't know if there's anything maybe you can do, Jefferson, to position your headset or just speak into it a little bit louder. It might help when things sort of drop a little bit in the volume, but for the most part, the volume seems to be coming through okay for me, but there are some folks on the line who are getting a little bit of fade in and out.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm dependent on the network for whether that's good or bad, but I also tend to mumble, so some of it's probably me. But yeah, so I was going through the timeline. I'll try to speak more loudly and clearly. Lots of places wanted us to do web archiving for them, and so in 2006 we started Archive It, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which is a sort of self-managed software as a service web application for people to build their own web archive collections using our tools, and we maintain the software as a service. We do lots of domain crawls, which is working with other countries to get an entire copy of their web-specific domain, like .uk, Ireland.ie, and a whole bunch of other ones around the world. We work directly to do the congressional web archiving for NARA, so that's another partnership. We do all sorts of more archive national libraries. We started doing some of our own very large global scale crawling, actually only about 15 to 18 years ago. So we mostly got small crawls and donated data before that, but in 2010 is when we really ramped up global scale crawling to try to get as good a snapshot of the entire global web as possible. We launched a new version of Archive It in 2014. We developed a whole bunch of new crawling technologies in 2016, and we're doing more API-based technical development and community-oriented capacity building as part of the last couple of years. So that's the end of those slides. Wayback Machine, people know it, so I won't say it. The web as a historical resource, I think people have a much better understanding of this now that it is, at least as a consumer platform, well-established, well-utilized, ubiquitous, huge, and so much media publishing and dissemination has migrated to the web. So it's consumed all media, and people weren't as cognizant. We might have been as content stewards and preservationists, but it's gotten much more public awareness in the last, say, 5 years, the historicity of the web. So that's been really exciting to see. As part of that, we've been trying to do tools that give people a better insight into the totality of the amount of web content that we have in our archive. And so there are here's an example, and we'll show the slides so you can go and look at the examples yourselves. But you can basically query to see what different types of documents have been collected over time, per year, and things like that, and a little charting around that, so you get more insight into what we have in the archive and when we collected it, things like that. Other tools like this that show sort of what the structure of that archive is, like directories or subdirectories or media types per year. So we've been experimenting with providing more provenance information for the web archive as it's become bigger and more used. So that's the intro part. Collecting and collections, we basically do this through 3 different modes. One is the global crawl that we run ourselves for our own sake. And I've listed a couple examples there. We try to get, say, at least the homepage and maybe a couple of subpages of the top X million, somewhere between 2 and 5 million websites. That's wide but shallow. And then we take the most traffic sites and try to get full copies of them every 3 months or 6 months, depending. And then also work with places like news organizations and government sites to get those more frequently, but in a more targeted manner. We also get URL lists from research projects. We get feeds from like social media or like aggregator type services that basically just give us feeds of URLs that people are looking at via their service. So we know that those are highly trafficked, and then we just crawl the specific URL. So that's our own crawling. We do crawling for other people on the domain scale, as I mentioned. We have platform integrations, so we get feeds from like online video platforms and places like that. Researchers are often doing their own crawling for data mining and then throw away the data. And we're like, why don't you give us the data? So we take deposits of web archives that others have collected but don't want to preserve. So that's another method of acquisition. And then I mentioned Archive.it, which is providing service and a web application and suite of technologies for people to do it themselves and basically give us a copy, and they get a copy, and we sort of share they mostly do the creation and we do the infrastructure. So that's sort of curated, topical, more focused and partner-oriented method. So those are the 3 streams of how web archiving happens at IA, and different types of communities contribute to each of those differently. So I think it's a useful model to think through, because many people only have insight into web archiving through one of these acquisition methods, like pay to get a contract, or use Archive.it, or donate data, or use Save Page Now and upload it to the Wayback Machine, things like that. So, but it all sort of becomes the Wayback Machine, which looks like one big interface, which is what it is. It's an interface to the whole content. But how things are collected are sort of all over the place. And that's both intentional, because you have different strategies for getting coverage and completeness and curation, instead of just sort of one entity managing the whole strategic endeavor of collecting. So it's cool, but it's sort of hidden from people, which I think is useful, but it's good insight for those of us in the community. So our harvesting, we're usually running hundreds of crawls a day through these various different activities, collecting about 1 billion documents per week, about 5 petabytes per year, and the web archive is about half of the total of the net archive, so currently about 20. I mentioned some of these, so I won't spend too much time on them. Basically work with DNS registrars in different countries to get the zone file, which is the list of every website in that country, or hosted in that country, or on that CCTLD, and then we crawl them all. And we then give the data to the National Library or the federal government, and various activities like that on a domain or global scale. We often provide access services too, so we'll do custom websites for people. So these are basically Wayback Machines, but only to a subset of specific content. For NARA, it's just congressional websites. For a national library, it's just websites in the country. So we also do, of course, search and full text search and all these discovery services in partnership and on contract with folks. We also do a lot of data analytics services, and these are important for the web to know what you're collecting because it tends to be so huge and so many millions of websites and billions of URLs that knowing how to evidence that or highlight it or even do like QA and things like that, you have to have some knowledge of the total volume. These are often in the dozens or hundreds of terabytes, many of these crawls. So knowing what language the sites are in, like what they link to, where they're linked from, and just the sort of makeup of the pages, whether it's a lot of HTML or whether it's highly dynamic content, things like that. So we do analytical services as well. So just some examples, we can analyze, say, in Archive.it for all what are the top 20 languages. That's pretty interesting, just doing language analysis. We did that for Australia, and so we can compare it to countries and see what languages make up large parts. So that's pretty fun. Some of that work also leads to data sets that we give to partners or to researchers. So lots of people are interested in mining the web for things like languages, especially for named entities. What are people talking about? Where are they talking about it? How often? Link graph type behavior, right? So, I mean, Google exists because Google figured out how to build a graph of what linked to other things and then make a service on top of it. So certainly graph-based analysis is huge these days and is sort of the, I don't know, what all the huge tech companies sort of made their money on, the underlying idea. So we do some of that too, of course, not as good as they do, but that's of interest to researchers is how people are connecting to each other either via link or names or talking about each other. So that's some examples of the data sets. We do fun time projects. Gift City was one of them. This is basically taking specifics of the web archive and do fun services. This was like an anniversary project, so we took all the animated GIFs from GeoCities and made a search engine on top of them using the file name of the GIF as the sort of search index. So I encourage people to go there and check it out. It's totally awesome. And we're trying to do other things, which is the web is old enough that it has this nostalgia factor, as well as just totally amazing content from its early portions that we can, it might not be, we don't have all of GeoCities in the web archive. We knew it was going down, so we have a great representation of it. Of course, not everything, because we can't collect the entirety of the web, even back in GeoCities era, but there are interesting ways to provide different faces to it that are not just like, I know the URL and I want to look at the old copy. And this was sort of a fun time R&D project to do that. So those are some of the specialized services. Archive.it, I hope people are familiar with because we're pretty widely used, at least in the US. This is basically a web account for people to build topical, thematic, or to archive versions of their own websites. Often they're university domains. So it has its own public access website. We do full text search, which the Wayback Machine does not do, as well as allowing people to add metadata and have faceting and provide their own descriptions and things like that. So there's a public access portal. On the back end, there's a whole web app that folks use to build their own collections. And it has all sorts of reporting tools around how much data you've collected, and you build collections and then crawl websites within those collections, and manage the crawls and do QA and all this kind of stuff. So this is just a slide that sort of summarizes the differences between these two different quote-unquote services. One is focused, one is more aggregate, one you highly controlled scope and frequency and management of crawling and access, whereas the Wayback Machine captures that are not in Archive.it tend to be more infrequent and sort of snapshot style. Archive.it, of course, we're a service, so we do technical support. Where the Wayback Machine, if the page looks like crap, then that's what you get. We do full text search and metadata search, both indexed, whereas Wayback Machine has not gotten there yet, mostly because of the size. It'd be very hard to do full text search on 20 petabytes of data for an institution that is not the size of Google, because we're pretty small and pretty scrappy. So there's services that we have more data than we do stuff with. And you can read the rest of it in there. Slide. Archivit has great adoption across at least the US community. I mentioned the educational users, about 600 over time. People are largely doing it for special collecting that matches their existing collecting mandate. So a topic that they might have great coverage on in print materials, they will also start collecting websites for. Almost everybody is archiving their own websites, of course, and they often have to do that for records management purposes or evidentiary or legal discovery or whatever. The event collecting has been very big in the last 10 years because when events happen locally, their representation and the, not just news, but people's blogs and pictures are all on social media and they're pretty much all on the web. So documenting events is pretty much done via web archiving phase. And that content disappears quite quickly, obviously. So doing it aggressively and reactively is important. We do full text search. As I mentioned, we have multiple crawling technologies. A lot of the technology development for the web archiving activities comes out of Archivit and is driven by the big user community, which does feature requests and does, helps us with testing and bug fixing and things like that. And that all feeds into Internet Archive's other web archiving activities. So that's awesome that we sort of have a community-driven technical development cycle, which is great. Where it's a subscription service, so people pay for data and they get a copy of the data and they get all the tools and they also get a whole bunch of APIs and stuff for integrating with their local services. And we work with other services like Locks and ArchiveSpace and Cloud and CLC and things like that. So trying to embed web archiving in people's broader digital collection management infrastructure has been a big focus in the last couple of years. So people they do use our service and then basically use our APIs for search and metadata and seed list and things like that, and integrate it directly into their own ILS or discovery systems. So that's super cool to see. Hopefully it helps facilitate making web archive as a thing more seamless discovery experience for students and users and things. So that's been great to see. That's sort of the overview of the services. So I'm making good progress because I'm on slide 43. So we should have plenty of time for conversation and Q&A around any of that. But I'll basically that's an overview of what we do and how we do it and how it works and who are our users and the size and all that stuff. But Matt and I certainly thought that what would be more interesting for this call and conversation, part of the call would be to talk about threats, risks, challenges, at least that we have, and that I think if others don't have, then they will very soon. Because of course the key component of this is that the web is consumed all these different publication and dissemination methods, and so if it's not on the web, then it's not really, people don't use it these days. So we tend not to think of web archives as a specific thing. It's just a method of acquisition, because you're still collecting books and you're still collecting research articles and movies and video and audio. You're just doing it all now. So that's the context of some of the threats, risks, and challenges that historical moment will not last, of course. And you can already see some of it challenged. So that's a bunch of logos on this page. So that probably gives away one of the big threats. Our risk challenge is the increasing platformization and, as they call it, a walled garden of some of these services, which sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally make it very hard to archive content on their platform using existing technologies. So some of them, like Facebook, might have a specific reason, and that they're so huge and ubiquitous and popular that they're very worried about hackers or external threats or denial of service attacks or people you know, trying to crawl their stuff for malfeasance or bad purposes, because an archival crawler is really not any different than, there are some differences, but at scale, it's not that much different than somebody else crawling it for, you know, scraping the content and trying to resell it or something. So web archiving approaches often overlap with the same approaches that other people use to collect web archiving content for non-archival purposes. So that's one of the challenges, is the platformization, and that many of these platforms are intentionally making it hard to archive their sites as a sort of business strategy. The second sort of piece of that is that many of them are making it difficult to archive because the speed of technology for web development runs much faster than the speed of technology for libraries and archives. So as websites and the web becomes more dynamic, more interactive, it is automatically generating a URL upon a user action instead of that URL being like hard linked. So programming languages that are used in websites, database-driven content that only delivers content via actual query instead of a click or a scroll. These are all challenges for collecting at scale. So there's of course ways to like launch a browser and then archive as you scroll, and we have some of those as well, sort of more user-driven. But those have nowhere near the same speed or capacity as traditional crawlers, which go very quickly. I mean, a URL a second or a minute per second, as opposed to what a normal user would do, which is a URL a minute or something. So huge capacity challenges around that. So one of the threats is the just JavaScript data-driven interactivity of the web, and that advances at a speed that's much greater than our scrappy library technology budgets will ever keep up with. So that's a constant challenge. So the technical solutions are always somewhat behind the new technologies as far as the web, because it's a consumer and, you know, public platform. It's not built for archival purposes, and preservation is way down the list of concerns of those who basically shape the evolution of the web and the underlying technologies. So that's a big one. So technical complexity of websites, the interactivity of required user behaviors for content discovery. Lots of things are behind paywalls, or they're in apps. So we won't even get to like phone stuff at this point. But you can see the appification even of the web off of like mobile devices is happening. So if it's not accessible via HTTP, then it's much, much harder to archive if it's archivable at all. We do have systems where we can log into things if the username and password are known and can be entered by a human. But, you know, that's still a stopgap approach. The scale, of course, is the other, you know, obviously technical challenge. The web grows exponentially, and none of our resources of anyone on this call grows exponentially for collecting. But I'll say something more about the economics of it. But just the crazy growth of the web makes, you know, capturing a representative portion of it harder and harder. So the bigger it gets, probably the smaller the percentage that we are capturing well gets every year, which is okay. I don't know what the right answer of what percentage we want to capture is, but that's a challenge. So I mentioned interactivity. We do have a browser that crawls, and so it sort of looks like this. It loads whatever this is, a Facebook site, and it logs in, and then it scrolls and looks at the feed and archives as it goes. So that's one example of an approach. And there are others that are similar to this, but loading things in a browser is very resource intensive. So you can't really spin up 2 million browser instances on existing infrastructure to do this method at scale. So how to manage the at scale methods with the like highly compute intensive or curated methods is one of the challenges. There's the legal corporate challenge. So GDPR is obviously on everybody's lips these days, and People are waiting to see how that will shake out. I'm sure everybody's getting 1,000 emails about people's updated like terms of service or whatever. That's been fun. The Digital Copyright, or DMCA, not DCMA, the Copyright Act, digital rights management, which is gonna, I guess, get baked into some of the forthcoming web frameworks in a terrible way. Net neutrality, so there's definitely a push to of corporate entities having more say in how the web evolves. And that's, of course, a bad thing, because that's not at all how it was created. It was created by researchers wanting to share data and openness and transparency. And, you know, that, of course, has bad sides and has led to, like, some of the bad actors in the space doing their thing, but I think had a greater social good in its origin. But it's a little worrisome to see the web very much taken over by people that for whom aggressive copyright takedown and rights management is their #1 priority. So I think that'll eventually lead to a very different web, at least as far as on the existing technologies. So that's a big challenge. Those are harder to navigate because they're not really about the acquisition or the replay. It's more a murky space. So we'll see how that shakes out. But that's one area that's probably more a threat than a real challenge. Economics, I have a good David Rosenthal quote here about the challenges of preserving information, and they're fundamentally economic. And I did a talk recently at a conference that was about the economics of web archiving, which I tried to actually spec out what ARL budgets were around how much they spent on collecting web materials in relation to how much they spent on collecting all the other materials. So I took Archivit because we have pretty good coverage of the research library sector as far as people using the tool to collect web stuff. So it was a good inroad to getting some hard data, which is a little squishy, but it's still data for looking at this. And so Archivit, again, about 600 total institutions, about 60% academic. And there's the pie chart, the rest are museums, state libraries, nonprofits, law libraries, commercials, et cetera, et cetera. And then we look at, of course, like the ARL trend of acquisition cost. And I think everybody knows that this like crazy chart that's the biggest one up and to the right is, of course, journal cost, and it's Elsevier and all those other folks charging 10% more every year for access to the journals, and sort of really being just a huge, huge burden on libraries as far as cost. So I took the ARL stats, since they do all these great stats about research libraries, to look at budgets. So I tried to break down these numbers. I'll try to go pretty quickly, and my point is sort of encapsulated on the next slide. But total ARL library budgets, about 3.5 billion. If you cut that, the average is about 30 million. Their stats say it's about 45% for acquisitions, which is books, journals, it's content acquisition, not like buying shares or whatever. So the average is about 13.5 million. Recurring acquisitions, a little less. That's usually subscriptions. So I'll think of that as journals, basically. And then I looked at the average amount that an ARL library spends to archive web content. And just to go back to the numbers, total budget, second, total expenses, acquisition expenses, recurring expenses, average per institution, 8.5 million. Average that they spend on web archiving, $12,000. So for an ARL library, the percentage of their acquisition budget dedicated to web archiving, 0.0009%. And this is for the web, which is where everybody puts their stuff these days. That's kind of crazy. So, you think about that for a moment. So then I tried to aggregate how much all of the ARLs together are acquiring in data volume from the web, and how much we're acquiring, and how much probably others, big institutions, are acquiring. And there are some numbers of those. So that's a little also quite terrifying, or surprising. Maybe not terrifying, but very surprising. So 95 terabytes basically per year for all the ARLs combined is a fraction of what IA collects per month. So There's the chart if you want to see it. And we're not a huge organization. Our entire budget, most of which is not web, is less than the acquisitions budget of an average ARL. So this is not bragging about IA, but the discrepancy between these polar opposites of acquisition cost and scale of acquisition are curious, and I think that they at least inform future conversations of how we can get more people collecting more at a bigger scale, because we all want to preserve stuff, right? So if University Library Archives spent 1% of their acquisition budget on archiving instead of 0.0009, they would expand their preserved historical copy of web documents by 20x. So that was my outcome stat. Third is the cloud. Matt mentioned that had been a theme across many of the content working group calls, and so I actually don't have that much to say to it because we have the luxury of running all our own data centers, but we have had many conversations with Amazon and AWS about putting Internet Archive data in the cloud. I know that many, if not most, universities are moving towards AWS or Google or Microsoft. They're one of the cloud providers for a lot of their storage and infrastructure, and that there are nonprofit efforts to help in that space. But it's a somewhat disturbing trend, so I think it will make a good conversation point because AWS has vendor lock, as they say, for this space. And I know many universities are basically being told that they have to move things to AWS. And it seems one might ponder whether this is exactly what happened with Elsevier in the commercial journals. Is ubiquity led to incessant price increases, which then became prohibitive to continued operation. So I think that'll make a good point for conversation is what role the cloud plays. It really doesn't play much of a role in our acquisition activities. People host websites and stuff in the cloud, but it's still on HTTP, so it doesn't matter as far as acquisition very much. Every once in a while, there are places that try to manage inbound traffic in a way to distribute it, and those are sort of cloud services, and those can interact with crawlers in ways that send them off on tangents. But it's not really a huge challenge or threat or risk for acquisition activities. I think of this as more of the cloud. The role of the cloud will be for preservation of digital content, and what that role is evolving, and it is mostly commercialized currently, and that is, I would think, big risk or threat to sustainability of the economics of preservation. And that is my last slide, right at 11:45, so I think I'm on time. There's the URLs and my email and stuff. And Matt had posed these Q&A questions in case nobody had any, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, awesome. Jefferson, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, so we've got some healthy time here for folks to throw some questions into the mix. I don't know that I see anything popping up on chat in the aggregate here. Lauren, maybe you've gotten some questions in the background, not sure. But folks can feel free to throw whatever questions have struck them over the course of Jefferson's talk here. Touched on some really, really cool stuff. Economics piece was really revealing.
I'll share the slides so people can dig into the numbers. And I don't promise they're authoritative, right? It's sort of like there's a lot of ballparking, but it's still pretty interesting to read through.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Jefferson, when you and I got around to sort of narrowing in on the talk here, one of the questions I certainly had was, just like what can the folks who are attending this call, NDSA members, or folks in their roles at their institutions, what can they do to sort of further, the preservation of the web? And, I think having some of these numbers and, sort of taking them back to different layers of admin in the institution to have a look at that and ask questions about, what they're doing to capture web content. Those numbers are really helpful. But what other questions do folks have? And Jefferson, maybe we want to give you some time to ask some questions too. So
Sure.
Feel free.
I'm happy to continue talking if there are no questions. I had to answer these ones you posed for when nobody has one.
Well, I think you did. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, that we had some in the queue here if we needed to turn them for any reason. And thanks for throwing them up here. I guess as I look back at these questions, I think you did a really good job of touching on most of them, or getting at most of them on some different levels. I guess I've always been a little bit curious, as you gather in media formats, and you all have to play that back in folks' browsers, legacy video formats and codecs. Is there anything that Internet Archive does sort of in the background, or just in streaming to bring those up to date for people's browsers to the degree that they even need to?
Not really. We haven't. A lot of our challenges on that stuff are like scale and number of users and number of people loading web pages via Wayback Machine at a time. So it's not that it's not possible to do emulation on the fly of websites and load in old browsers and old web today. People don't know about it, look it up. It's a great example of looking at old websites in old browsers. And we do software emulation, as folks probably know. You can go and play the old games in emulated environments, but the two haven't joined in a high scale way. So we kind of do both, but we haven't necessarily married them in a way that's like seamless user experience via Wayback Machine. So that's mostly emulation, which is not migration. We don't migrate much stuff. The other example, so yeah, super old websites will look super janky in your new version of Chrome, even if you're looking at it in Wayback Machine. There's not much we can do about that. I mean, we could, but again, it's a scale problem. We don't much migrate content, and I guess the other big one, at least for the web, is like Flash, which depends on client-side plugins. So I guess that would be a challenge, but that's not a huge issue for the web for the most part. Browsers are really good at rewriting stuff,
Yeah.
even old stuff, which is one of the nice aspects of the web. So most old image formats will still load. The only examples I can think of offhand are like real player files and Flash files.
Yeah, right.
And in those cases, if you have a local plugin, then it probably might work.
Great. Well, we've got a question from Boston College. It says in the chat here, you'd mentioned that you guys run your own data centers. Can you speak to how geographically distributed those are, and any further plans, if not, to get them distributed?
They are geographically distributed, yes. So full copies in many places, the most in California, with many parses around the world. And some of those partial copies are in other institutions, like the National Library of Egypt, because the Library of Alexandria partnership has a lot of early data, and certainly a lot of our web archiving services, people take copies of the data that we crawl on their behalf. So lots of the national libraries and plenty of the academic institutions have copies. So ideally, we want everything to be replicated partially somewhere with partners. But yeah, there's basically, let's say, 4.5 data centers, and they're geographically and geopolitically distributed.
Okay, great. There's another question that I've gotten in the background here, kind of getting back to the economics question. Do you have some practical strategies for how libraries can sort of move that information up effectively to admins to spend a little bit more on web archiving?
Yeah, I think what everybody starts doing web archiving, preserving their own websites. And so effective, collaborative, like networked solutions to thematic, topical event collecting are where, or is like what everybody goes to in the second stage of their web archiving program development. Like first, it's like make sure you're getting your whatever university.edu web domain well captured. And most people can make an easy argument for that because their university archives is already doing it. And all the stuff that the university archives is collecting is now a PDF on the web, or it's student websites or whatever. So that argument is easy to make, but I think the next level is, well, we're also gonna collect, blogs of, human rights activists. And there's some great examples of these, and they're often already part of a library's collecting strategy. But what I think people haven't gotten to is that human rights activists collecting in private papers and books about it are also 15 other universities' areas of focus. So how to get those 15 to work together to do a super mega collection lets everybody collect their own portion of it. So like thematic, topical, event, special collection, .gov. We've seen some of this around the what used to be the GovDocs network, and all the GovDocs are now online. I think that's a valuable argument for people because they can do a fraction of it, but contribute to a global scale coverage of a specific topic. So that's one avenue, and the other is sort of like collection-based network building, and the other is organizational profile-based. So we got an IMLS grant to do public libraries. They're basically, prior to the grant, were like 2 or 3 that were doing web archiving, but public libraries have amazing local history collections, right? But they're also incredibly resource strapped. So that was like an organizational profile, is there's thousands of public libraries. They have great collections. How can we provide the infrastructure? And they do the local community building. They know the websites to collect. And we're just like handling the technology and the storage and access for them. And I think that can be done for lots of other types of institutions, historical societies, even research institutes within universities. So once you can marry organizational profiles and interest in archiving and preservation in that way, which is a sort of network effect of institutions and a network effect of collecting. But those are arguments that are easy for people to make locally because it's not a huge thing. It's not like we're going to collect all the human rights websites. We're going to work with 8 others, and we only have to dedicate this little part of our time and money to getting this portion of it. But it feeds into a greater thing. So I think that was kind of a long answer, but it's building these network effects that the technology is already there for people to do it, and so getting people to sort of hook in to the networks and then contribute their local capacity is kind of the next round, I think, the next wave of scaling collecting.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Actually, that certainly resonates here on my side of things. We're at the state level, kind of looking to move forward and start collaborating a lot more with our peer institutions and some of the state institutions. So I definitely will bring that up.
Yeah, certainly the state libraries archives are, I think we work with, like 40 of the 50 and been trying to get them, they have their mandates and their stuff they have to do, but they're also great hubs, right, for their state, especially to some of the smaller heritage or preservation organizations that aren't well resourced. So if they can play a leadership or a convening role, that's the part that like we, IA, or most of the big national institutions are not connected, like super local, hyper local level. But we have tools that the hyper local level can use. So joining forces in that way is a social architecture problem. Not a problem, but like a social project, not a technical one.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we certainly have time for maybe another question. I do want to let everybody know that right at the 3 o'clock hour, we're going to have to close down because the line is reserved for another NDSA meeting, and we will just get effectively cut off at 3 as they hop on. But Jefferson, do you mind rewinding one slide back so folks can just see your contact info again real quick? And Jefferson's email was in with the agenda and the link to the call here today too.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm sure folks can feel free to reach out to you if they've got some other questions. Do folks have any other last minute questions for Jefferson? No, well, feel free to reach out to him. Jefferson, thanks a ton for taking the time to do this. And I really appreciate you just sort of tailoring a huge portion of your talk here towards the content focus for things. I think that everything you touched on certainly connected with my thoughts and concerns around this, and I hope it did for others too. Okay, folks. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up, and folks can stay tuned for the recording for today's call and drop in on the minutes. Lauren, thanks for all your work capturing the Jefferson's presentation and conversation here, and we'll catch up with folks on the next call in July. Okay. Thanks, everybody.